Let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This event is presented by COOLNow, Compostable Organics out of Landfills Now, a program of Zero Waste USA, and we're proud to welcome Betsy LaForce of Green Mountain Technologies, who will be walking us through the practical fundamentals of planning an onsite composting facility. Before we begin, a little housekeeping. If English is not your first language, Zoom is set to allow translated closed captions. You can turn these on using the captions button in your Zoom toolbar and select the language you'd prefer. I'll also need to mention some upcoming events from Zero Waste USA. Tomorrow, June 10th, the Save the Albatross Coalition is hosting Captain Charles Moore for a presentation on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And looking further ahead, the National Zero Waste Conference takes place over 2 days this October. These and the full calendar of Zero Waste USA events are available on our main website, and I'll drop a link in the Zoom chat. Let me go ahead and do that now so you have it. Let's see. And so those are the links there. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Betsy LaForce is the Sales and Business Development Manager at Green Mountain Technologies, with nearly a decade of compost industry experience spanning hauling, environmental advocacy, and project management. She's testified at numerous public hearings on composting, including before Charleston County Council, and has written widely on the subject, including for the Post and Courier. A South Carolina native and a graduate of the College of Charleston, she holds certifications in permaculture design from the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, Master Naturals training from Clemson, climate leadership training through the Climate Reality Project, and the 2024 Compost Operator Training Certification from the U.S. Composting Council. She's an active community volunteer and a certified climate ambassador for the city of Charleston. Betsy, thank you for being here. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Chris, and to the COOLNow team for inviting Green Mountain Technologies to present today. Excited to be here and to see many familiar faces. I loved all the notes coming in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Oh, is that view, Chris?
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for the introduction. As Chris mentioned, my name is Betsy LaForce. I work with Green Mountain Technologies, and I specialize in our smaller scale on-site in-vessel composting solutions, which is perfect for the topic we're going to be diving in today about decentralized composting, a movement that's gaining traction around the country and around the world. And excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the examples that we've seen through successful installations and implementation of technology. For the presentation today, since we're limited on time, I decided to focus on one recent installation, and that's Beaufort County in South Carolina, which is where I live, to talk about the themes of this decentralized composting kind of movement and how to set it up, regardless of if you're a municipal leader, working for a private institution, a nonprofit, a college campus, any of the above. This could apply to kind of all of those settings. And as we saw in the description, Traverse City in Michigan, Rutgers University in New Jersey, Miami Nation of Oklahoma, First Nations communities, Iswatag in British Columbia, new installations in Deerfield Beach down in Florida, University of South Florida and St. Petersburg. So lots of activity with Green Mountain. We're just one equipment provider. There are many out there available to choose from, but excited to talk about a little bit about our experience today. So without further ado, let's dive right on in. See if I can control this here by clicking. Okay, so a little bit about Green Mountain Technologies. Our company has been around for just over 30 years. We are headquartered in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States, so the Seattle area. I myself live in South Carolina in the Low Country, part of the Southeast on the coast, and I met the Green Mountain Technologies team actually at the United States Compost Council conference that was held in Charleston, where I live, about 5 or 6 years ago. So those of you attending today, if you have not heard of or been to the USCC annual conference, I highly recommend checking it out. Next year, it'll be held in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where I'm presenting to you from today. I'm at the Mayo Clinic. My mom is in the hospital. So luckily I'm able to work remotely and help support her through her surgery and still get to talk to all of you about this important work. And just to kind of set the stage, as I was eating from the cafeteria yesterday at the Mayo Clinic, if any of you have been, it's an outstanding facility, great food. I asked one of the people working if they had any composting programs in place. I was just curious. Some hospitals do, some don't, some are considering it. And her response to me was, no, she's tried it, but she just can't do bugs. So the conversation kind of ended there. I didn't want to push it or make anyone feel judged, but just to remind everyone, I know this group, we're composting advocates, we're familiar with the benefits, but it was a reminder for me, as I get so often, that the education piece is really important, helping people understand that by starting to compost, their waste profile isn't changing, whether it's small scale or large scale. It's just kind of how you're doing it and where you're putting it and how it's being managed. So bugs are going to be there one way or the other, right? So we're going to talk about enclosed technology primarily today, which helps address some of those understandable concerns. So today we're going to kind of quickly walk through what I consider to be 6 core pillars of a successful decentralized operation. So we'll talk a little bit about the economic and environmental case. We won't spend too much time on this because I know I'm preaching to the choir, which is great. But specifically for processing organics on site rather than hauling them far away. I think one of the biggest challenges that's facing the composting industry and those of us that are interested in composting is just access and proximity to facilities, right? A lot of people, a lot of places and communities want to compost, but they don't have access to a large enough facility to be able to make that happen beyond their own home or their own backyard. So we'll also talk a little bit about capitalization strategies, funding, touching on federal grants, but also focusing on the return on investment and that economic fiscal argument to city council and county council that can be really resonant, how avoided landfill fees and local funding mechanisms, you can start small programs without having to increase taxes or really change anything too much from the current goings on of the local government. After that, we'll touch on the regulatory landscape. Of course, that depends on your local state, your locality, your municipality, but there's a lot of common themes kind of threaded throughout, especially with this smaller scale on-site technology as compared to larger scale. We'll also talk a little bit about engineering, so selecting the technology, and then how to combat some of those understandable and important concerns around vector controls, odors, all of that. And then how to keep a successful program running and what's really important for that. And I know many of you in the audience, I saw some names, can speak directly to that. So we're going to save time for Q&A at the end. I'll try to make my portion as short as possible without skipping over anything important, so we can also learn from the collective wisdom from the group that's registered today. Some of you are actively in the field managing these programs and managing this exact technology. So I saw Courtney from the food bank and James Hoffer joined. Thank you both for being here. So decentralized composting, many of you might have heard of this term. What is it? Why are we talking about it? So a lot of these climate goals, right, and carbon reduction emissions, cost savings, objectives, a lot of this is pretty bipartisan. And so we're talking about reversing the expensive costs, the long distances, the labor, the time, the trucking, the wear and tear that's involved with hauling material long distances to those limited facilities that are currently available. More are popping up all the time, which is great. But still, we kind of are reliant on this traditional MO of centralized waste management. So all of the waste, whether it's food scraps that couldn't have been donated or fed to animals or people first that need to be composted, regular landfill trash, recycling, C&D waste across the whole city region is going to one big processing facility, and all of it gets processed there with the same big equipment. You know, some of the benefits are larger equipment, easier to manage, maybe less staff, but you've got the distance challenge. And in today's economy, as most of us are experiencing every day, the cost of fuel is going up, cost of land is going up. So I know this group keep organics out of landfills now. The more organics that are going to landfills, more material, the landfills are filling up. We have to find new land. Land's not getting any cheaper. So all of these realistic arguments are making the case for decentralized composting. Along with that, composting in place, composting in your community, keeps those nutrients, those valuable resources exactly where they're generated. So you're reducing the emissions, the labor, the time, and you're protecting those valuable resources that can be used in the community, whether it's for growing food, selling the compost, using the finished compost for public works initiatives, parks, road projects, so many uses for the finished product that I think a lot of communities that maybe don't have composting programs in place yet might not realize really how much money is being spent on capital expenditures to cover the cost of annual purchase, maybe quarterly purchases of essentially topsoil, right? Is the compost that we can make in our community with the material that would have otherwise been not only thrown away, but we would have had to pay taxpayer dollars and resources to have that material processed, driven away, and ultimately landfilled. So tons of reasons to talk about composting, to decentralize the composting process. And then with this smaller scale that we're talking about today, one of the biggest benefits in my mind is just how quickly these programs can get put into place, can become operational. So the example we're going to be talking about today, Beaufort County, South Carolina, traditionally not super progressive environmentally speaking from a policy perspective, but lawmakers and residents alike, we love our clean water, clean air, the natural elements. We want to preserve that. But we don't have, a lot of composting facilities. So there's 4 big ones throughout the whole state. Beaufort County didn't have access to a compost facility. And for many years, they kind of thought, well, I guess we just can't compost because it's the closest compost facility is too far away to make it make sense for the hauling. They're doing great with recycling. They were, of course, doing the regular landfilling, but wanted to compost, but really just kind of couldn't figure out how. And once they discovered the path, the timeline from getting the money in hand to getting the permit off the ground and operational was less than 1 year, which is pretty impressive if you know about how long some of those municipal approvals and projects can take to get approved, funded, engineered, permitted, all that stuff. So here's a photo from the Beaufort County installation. You can see it's a compact footprint. They did opt for a concrete pad. It's not a requirement. You could do something like this in-vessel earth flow composting machine that we're going to be talking about today on even packed gravel. So like we talked about, Charleston County was the closest compost facility to Beaufort County, almost 2 hours away. So that just didn't make sense for them financially or logistically, as Beaufort County officials and program managers were looking into and having conversations with hauling companies like, hey, we'd like to hire you to pick up our organics. We want to start a residential drop-off. Can you take it to the closest composting facility? And the answer was, yes, we can, but starting to look at the numbers, it just totally deteriorated because it's just way too far away. So it kind of eliminated all of the good that was going to come from reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And again, keeping those nutrients and resources in place by trucking them a long way away and having to pay for all of that fuel and distance. So also Beaufort started with a pilot program. We're hearing a lot about these pilot programs. They're great because it's kind of low risk. You can start small without investing too much money and time, and without needing the involvement of too many different people or departments to kind of take a bite out of the apple and demonstrate the concept and prove that it can be successful. So Beaufort County decided to start by kind of limiting their material that they were going to be accepting. So some of you on the call, you might live in a community where organics are collected at the curb. So that's about as easy as it can get, right? From a residential standpoint, if you want to compost. But if you're thinking about starting a program and you don't have a compost facility nearby or any programs already in place, that might be really intimidating to think about curbside collection from day one. So a really popular model that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the residential drop-off model. Some benefits to this, especially with a pilot, is you're getting people that care enough about composting to sign up for the program. It's totally optional, and take the time out of their lives to take the little quiz, and also take the steps to separate the organics at home and take them to a convenience center, maybe where they're already taking their recycling. So rather than starting kind of top down with a policy or a mandate requiring, whether it's state or local level, hey, everyone, you have to start composting now. That's a great goal to reach for, and maybe eventually will be like Washington State, California, where you can't put organics in the landfill. I know we're all hoping for that, but starting there can be really hard and more challenging than it needs to be. So starting small, opt in. Beaufort County was able to kind of say, okay, we know with this limited number of residents, and maybe we're going to do a couple of schools, a couple of restaurants to help bring in enough material to get the pile hot, to generate enough material to have compost to give to our local farmers, to show the community what we're doing here. But without having so much participation right from the beginning that it would be overwhelming from a staff and equipment standpoint. So again, I like to highlight with this program, I think one of the biggest wins and examples for this project is by partnering with the State Department of Environmental Services, Beaufort County was able to get their project permitted in under 30 days. I don't know about you guys, but for me, that's unheard of, especially in South Carolina. So we'll get into a little bit more about how they did that. So some of you might be wondering, okay, that's great. Beaufort County got an earth flow and they were able to do this project, but maybe my community wouldn't have the same luck being able to fund something like that or finding the money. So let's talk about the money, because that's where a lot of these decentralized projects can stall out before they even begin. So if you're trying to fund a compost facility, I just want to say that you don't need to invent a brand new tax. You don't need to overhaul your city's whole financial structure, or maybe change to like a pay-as-you-throw model where waste is now a utility. Sidebar, all of these things are great. If you can do that, if there is the appetite and the climate in your local community to do one of those things, absolutely. But if there's not, like there wasn't in mine, you don't have to rely on those things. So there's still a lot of federal and state grant funding available despite recent changes with the administration. I know grants are down overall, and it's hurting a lot of nonprofits, a lot of industries, but it seems that for the composting industry and the composting movement, again, waste being kind of a nonpartisan issue, grant money is still there, because I think we can all agree that we need to save our landfill space and reduce our costs. So composting does exactly that. So it's making that financial argument, looking at your processing cost in your area. What is the landfill tipping fee? What is the cost of fuel? What is the hourly rate for folks that are operating those facilities and driving those trucks? Adding that all up together, and we have some internal spreadsheets that I'm happy to share with anyone who might want to use that, kind of put together that customized ROI for your location. But on average, processing cost is about $200 per ton. So that's not just, landfilling it and the cost associated with that, but from the whole beginning to end. So picking it up, hauling it, all of the fuel, all of that. So it's really, really expensive. And if you can kind of make that clear to decision makers, it starts to become less about this is an environmental initiative, for a bunch of tree huggers. I'm not a tree hugger, talking head like a politician. I think we probably all are tree huggers, but we don't have to use that messaging if it's not going to work for the audience that we're presenting to, right? So it's kind of understanding your audience, and if maybe the environmental message or the climate message isn't the one that's going to resonate, lean on the fiscal message. And then also look at those grants that are there to absorb initial equipment costs. Those capital expenditures are sometimes the biggest piece. And then you have your operating costs for labor, some of the soft costs for education and signage and tabling and, you know, time on the weekends to get people familiar with the program. But to get started and to get the equipment, there's a lot of grants available. So Beaufort County, they were able to secure a USDA solid waste management grant, and it was a game changer for them. It allowed them to acquire the equipment and the technology, and they didn't have to ask local taxpayers to foot the bill. So there was limited conversation that happened at the county level to pass this initiative because they found the funding. They didn't have to ask for the funding. And another really powerful thing that you can do early on is use your community's official policy roadmap to unlock local dollars. So what I mean by that is make sure composting initiatives are explicitly identified in your town's or county's comprehensive plan. If there's a climate action plan, if there isn't one yet, there probably will be one coming soon. So once those targets are formally written into an adopted plan, it totally changes the conversation. So you're creating an official municipal directive, making it so much easier to justify those budget allocations later because you're simply funding the implementation of an already approved plan that residents, you know, voted on and agreed upon. So that's really important, getting composting into these comprehensive and climate action plans. And then a third option is financing. So similar to buying a home with a mortgage, especially municipalities can use flexible financing to cover remaining gaps. Maybe you find a grant for $60,000, but you need $60,000 more to cover the cost of the equipment that you're trying to get in place, or the land that you're trying to secure, whatever it might be. So by using private bank financing, through something like a municipal lease purchase agreement, local governments can buy capital equipment like an earth flow in vessel system or other, you know, equipment that's available, and pay for it over time, over a 5 to 10 year period. So because it's structured like an annual lease rather than long-term debt, it protects that immediate cash flow and doesn't require a public bond election. So yes, moving on to the next slide. We've gotten the kind of hard part, the not so fun part out of the way, talking about the money. Let's talk about siting the equipment, selecting the site, how much space do you need? So this is another huge benefit of decentralized composting. You don't need acres and acres and acres and these kind of sprawling open air facilities that many folks that are less familiar with composting than we are associate with in their minds. When they think of a composting facility, they're thinking of a big landfill campus or a big open air facility, and they're thinking there's no way we'll be able to acquire that much land to do a composting project. But with decentralized infrastructure, the site selection strategy totally flips. So firstly, you can look at co-location opportunities. You don't need to buy new land. Where could you put something like an earth flow, which again, you see in this photo here. This is from Traverse City, Michigan. Their public-private partnership with Carter's Compost does the hauling. Traverse City owns the land. And then Carter's Compost also does the education, and Seeds, actually 3 groups, help support that initiative with educating the residents, getting the material from point A to point B, putting it in the machine and monitoring the health of the composting process and the quality of the finished product. So the city provides the land that was already available. They just had to set aside, you know, not even a quarter of an acre to put this in-vessel machine, which is made from a retrofitted shipping container. So it was pretty low ask for them and pretty easy for them to do. So what land exists in your area that the county already owns and operates, like convenience centers, or maybe a transfer station, or a public works yard, or even a wastewater treatment plant, or the existing landfill. You could put an enclosed composting machine on a small corner of any one of those existing operations and have it tie seamlessly into what's already happening there. So because these systems require such a small footprint, we're utilizing this automated vertical in-vessel composting system. Again, instead of the outdoor, windrows or even an aerated static pile, which can take more land and require maybe higher intensive foundation, like larger concrete pads or covers if it's not an enclosed kind of self-contained unit. And finally here, proximity to source. So siting these assets close to home, close to the generation point of where this material is being generated is what solves that hauling barrier to entry, the proximity barrier to entry. So by putting the technology right in the community zone where the waste is generated, like at the convenience center, you're eliminating those long distance costs of trucking and hauling, and you're keeping everything local. You're keeping the waste local, the benefits local. So finding the right piece of land is half the battle. Next is securing the legal green light for operating on it. Here's a picture of the empty Beaufort County compost vessel. You can see on the right-hand side, this is the exposed biofiltration system before it's covered with wood chips. So you wouldn't see the pipe on grade portion, you would just see the pipe on the side. This is a secondary odor mitigation measure that's using negative aeration to pull the process air out of the head of the composting vessel and neutralize that through the wood chip pile. So again, greatly reducing or eliminating any kind of air quality emission concerns that would come from a larger facility. And behind the Beaufort County earth flow, you can also see they have a covered structure that they're using to store their dry carbon bulking agent, which is a really important element of the planning and the operation of any good composting process. You need carbon and nitrogen. So food scraps, or if you're composting horse manure, whatever it is you're composting with the nitrogen piece, you also need to source carbon. So a lot of these municipal local programs, they've got the carbon already. They're collecting leaf and yard waste, maybe at the curb, and stockpiling that at existing county facilities. So if you start bringing in food scraps, now you have a perfect recipe to really start making some high quality, premium, nutrient rich finished compost to use in community agriculture projects. Another couple pictures, the one on the bottom right kind of shows the whole side with the control panels of the earth flow. And the front, you can see that small yellow box is the trim lift tote tipper. So if you're collecting material in carts, maybe at a community drop site where residents are bringing their food scraps and putting it into locked carts, then you can push that cart right up to the front of your compost machine and have it automatically tipped in, so further reducing labor time for the operators. So as we touched on, permitting is typically the scariest checkpoint of any municipal waste project. Usually that default assumption is that working with state and environmental regulators can mean entering a long process, sometimes painful bureaucratic battle with red tape and back and forth. Some in favor, some against. You've got some community members sometimes coming out wanting to oppose anything having to do with waste, right? Because they might be rightfully concerned that there's going to be odors, there's going to be vectors, maybe an influx of hawks or seagulls, hovering perhaps near their neighborhood if it's going to be sited next to a compost facility. So the experience with Beaufort County and their recently permitted project that was permitted early this year in January, it was the total opposite experience. And that's because they changed their approach. So the important thing to note with them is, or follow their example, you don't have to wait until you've already purchased your equipment or maybe secured your land or gotten a lease agreement don't wait for those stages to start engaging with your regulators. So on day one, when your initial feasibility study, start engaging them. If you show up with a blank piece of paper and say, we're thinking about doing a small scale in-vessel composting facility. We want to work together to accomplish this. What do we need to do to fit your rules? They will look at you and treat you more as a partner than, perhaps a challenging adversary or just another person going through the process. So really using that collaborative approach. Secondly, you want to use the existing rules to your advantage. So in many states, solid waste regulations contain conditionally exempt or perhaps low risk tiers having to do with, volume threshold. So how much material is going to be stored or stockpiled on the site at any one time. So decentralized volumes, typically smaller volumes, we're talking, under 5,000 tons per year. A lot of times that's easier to permit because there's less risk with less material. And then with the technology, by proving that containment, that self-contained nature of something like an in-vessel system or an enclosed system, you're giving the state, if that's your regulatory agency, the confidence that they need to approve a conditional permit in weeks rather than perhaps months or even years. So let's look at how this decentralized kind of in-vessel solution stacks up against other types of composting facilities and technologies. So the data on this table shows a stark contrast in some regulatory realities. So under South Carolina solid waste rules, food scraps are classified as Category 2 feedstock. That's because they have a higher moisture content, higher pathogen risks than simple yard waste, yard debris. A traditional open windrow facility requires a full permit. This can sometimes trigger 6 to 18 months of complex, stormwater considerations, engineering designs, extensive odor mitigation plans, mandatory certified compost managers on site, which is a good idea, no matter the size of your facility. When you pivot to a decentralized enclosed system, like the Beaufort example that we've been talking about, this equation becomes dramatically simplified. Because the container is sealed, there's no exposed food waste, no runoff that's coming in contact with the environment. With the earth flow, for example, there's a leachate collection system that's built into the floor. So if there is an influx of moisture, maybe the feedstock on one particular day has a lot of extra water, a lot of extra liquids, that's going to get contained in the floor of the system so the operator can collect it safely and put it back into the front of the earth flow instead of having it run into, off into the ground, potentially contaminating the groundwater. So the county was able to work with DES to secure a conditional exemption in Beaufort. But for them, South Carolina state laws still require a certified compost operator. So a couple folks from their team were able to get that certification online. Victoria Hoffman actually went to Raleigh this year and got her compost operator training certificate in person. And that was a really fun professional development opportunity for her as the recycling and sustainability kind of programs coordinator to now have this new knowledge under her belt and help contribute to the staff redundancy at their earth flow site. So she also understands the fundamentals of composting. But with Beaufort, by choosing this enclosed system, they eliminated a lot of those engineering and environmental hurdles that can really drag out the process. So a little bit about odor, again, at a smaller kind of pilot scale with less volumes. Typically, these systems fall way below state thresholds for odor requirements. So making them exempt from a lot of those more difficult standard air quality construction permits. Because again, those odors generated from the process aren't just drifting passively into the neighborhood like they could with an open windrow system. This in-vessel system, we looked at the biofilter, uses that negative pressure to draw the air through biofilter media in conjunction with forced aeration that's coming up through the floor of the system. So kind of a double whammy to attack the process from going anaerobic, which can really generate a lot of those foul odors that, you know, we might have smelled just from your food scrap bucket on your counter for too many days in a row. So let's look a little bit at the engineering and some of what makes this so easy to operate, such little, little labor compared to other types of composting processes, and easy again to kind of permit. And we call it plug and play because these types of systems are custom built to order. They're fabricated inside of a retrofitted shipping container and then shipped to the location, to the site. And then our engineers come out and plug everything in, get everything operational, and do a comprehensive on-site training that spans a couple of days for how to operate the machine and how to maintain the machine through preventative maintenance best practices. And if something does break, like a chain, how to fix that, and then having availability and access to remote support as needed as well. So looking on the screen here, we see the internal schematic of the in-vessel system that was used in the Beaufort pilot. So a lot of people, again, that are less familiar with composting than we are, just keep in mind, they're picturing a slow process, maybe a process that has a lot of visible bugs, odors, and at the end of the composting process, maybe still has those visible eggshells or compostable materials that didn't quite break down if they're thinking of a backyard pile or something like a windrow. So with an enclosed system, another benefit is just how fast that whole compost process is expedited. So it's about a 3-week retention time in the vessel. 21 days is what we recommend for food scraps. You don't need quite that much time if you're doing like horse manure and bedding. And it's a continuously loaded, continuous flow operating system. So you're loading material into the front end where the windows are, and there's a daily capacity limit. So we're looking at a schematic of our smaller system. It's 20 feet long. Assuming 7 days a week of operation, you can load in every day about 500 pounds of food scraps, and you need to balance that with 500 pounds of carbon bulking agent. So in any real hot aerobic biological composting process, carbon is going to be involved. That's what's actually getting composted, is the carbon, not the food scraps. So if you're ever kind of looking at different technologies and you see something that maybe says makes compost in 24 hours, and you're looking into it and you're like, wow, this is really easy and convenient. We don't even have to put carbon in here. We just put the food scraps in. Typically, that means it's actually not a composter and it's more of a dehydrator, where you're baking the moisture out of the food scraps, drying the material. But the result of that isn't actual finished compost. It's dehydrated food scraps, basically. So if you wanted to use it for horticulture or agriculture, which is a great way to, add on to that return on investment argument, you wouldn't actually be able to do that, because if it rehydrated, it would turn into a slimy, kind of messy situation that would be attracting those vectors and kind of creating a lot of the environmental hazards that we're trying to avoid for regulatory reasons and just to be a good neighbor. We don't want composting to get a bad rap. We want it to be done well and to make good compost and not have a foul odor. So if you are thinking about starting a composting program, it is important to really think about what are your goals. And if one of your goals is to make compost, to be able to have access to that and use it in the community, you want to make sure that you're getting, if you are looking at sort of the enclosed machine route, that you're getting a machine that's going to make real compost and not sort of like a dehydrated food waste material. Oops, okay, let me go back for a second. So this system, as I mentioned, it takes about 21 days to move from the front to the back. You can see, if you take a quick look inside, the traveling auger. So that's sort of the trademark of this particular in-vessel system. There's a lot of different in-vessel systems out there. Some of them are rotary drums. The thing I really like about the Earthflow, I'm biased, of course, as a representative for Green Mountain, but taking that hat off and just putting my educator hat on, one of the great things about the Earthflow is how visible the whole process is. So especially if education is a component of your program, maybe you want to involve the community or get the schools involved or have volunteers. It's nice for them to be able to see the whole composting process in one little shipping container. Some other machines that are on the market have what we call sort of like the black box effect. So you can see what you're putting in, but once it gets inside, you can't see it anymore until it comes out of the machine. So with the earth flow, you can see what you're putting in, and then the whole 3 weeks while the banana peel and the rest of the food scraps are making their way from the front to the back, getting pulled by that auger that's moving side to side, back and forth, turning around like a corkscrew. So pulling the heavy wet material from the bottom to the top, and really just blending that material and homogenizing all the moisture and the air coming through the floor. You can see it happening every step of the way. Because of that, you can also, as the compost operator, say, hey, this looks a little too dry, or this looks a little too wet. We need to add some more wood chips, or we need to add some more water, or there's too much nitrogen, there's not enough air getting through. So it's nice to be able to make those adjustments by seeing the process and catching anything that might be going awry. So yeah, this is one of the best machines for odor control, again, because it's self-contained and because of the forced aeration coming through the floor and the mechanical agitation. So those two elements, the aerating the pile and agitating, are typically the most laborious of any compost process. I'm sure many of you have backyard compost piles or have volunteered with community composting initiatives. You're shoveling, you're turning by hand, human-powered composting to do the aeration, to do the agitation. And it can be, backbreaking work, for lack of a better term. So one of the benefits of a system like this is you're reducing all that labor because it's so highly automated, but you still have the operator kind of ensuring that everything is processing seamlessly. So before we move away from this slide, I'll ask you to also notice the integrated control systems on the right. So to legally kill off things like weed seeds and human pathogens, state regulations often require that the core of the internal material of the compost pile maintain 131 degrees Fahrenheit for several days. So instead of sending staff out into the elements with manual probes and thermometers, unless they want to do that, which is great, something like this can provide internal digital sensors that help to regulate the temperature and automatically log temperatures and metrics for things like state compliance reports. Or if you want to share with your constituents and the resident base, like, hey, we diverted 20 tons of food scraps in the last few months. So that can all be automatically tracked and logged. What else to mention here? Oh, so ready to cure compost, the material that comes out the back, it looks like finished compost, it smells like finished compost, but it's still really hot and biologically active. So it's 3 weeks of retention time in the vessel, but before you start using that material to grow food or fill your pots or donate to farmers, you want to let it cure and stabilize for about 30 days. And there's no labor involved in that process. You just let the material sit and cure in a static pile, typically outside of the vessel. Some people like to cover their curing piles with something like a simple hoop house or even just a tarp. If you don't want rain to come in contact with it, that's sort of a matter of preference, but you do want to let the material sit for 30 days before using it or selling it. So technology, really important piece, helps to address a lot of the concerns and a lot of the labor, but you can have the best technology in the world and you still need a human operator, the human element and the human touch to have a successful program. So success in a decentralized pilot, it's not about working harder, but it's about a disciplined strategy and a consistent daily routine. Every successful project needs a dedicated champion. We have a few of those on the call today, as I mentioned, so hopefully you'll ask them some questions. But this is a person who owns the program, owns the results, owns the health of the compost, and keeps the momentum moving and growing. But it's difficult to rely on just one person. Relying on one person, there's a single point of failure, so it's a good idea to build operational redundancy by cross-training multiple team members. So if your lead operator is out for a week on vacation, your composting process doesn't have to grind to a halt. Secondly, when you're, if you are talking to elected officials or trying to get buy-in to start a program, another big misconception, because it depends on the approach to composting, is the labor requirement. So a really big fear for a lot of, waste program directors, public works directors is that composting project's going to be an all-day, full-time project and a labor sink and a high labor cost. But in reality, with an in-vessel machine like the ones we've been talking about, this is sort of a bolt-on task. So meaning the daily routine of basically getting the material from point A to point B, loading it into the system, and following that recipe that you're trained on. So balancing the carbon and the nitrogen, making sure there's enough moisture, making sure that there's enough airflow in the pile. So the carbon management. Again, the secret to real composting is including that carbon element, which allows the pile to have the porosity that's needed to let the air flow up through the compost pile so it doesn't go anaerobic and get those foul odors. Good news with the carbon is that you don't always have to buy it. Typically, this is a pretty abundant resource that's readily available in a lot of communities. So you can source it by diverting the town's own leaf and yard waste, or by looking to free services like Chip Drop to have local tree trimmers deliver wood chips to your composting site for free. So planning for keeping that stockpile dry is what prevents odors, what keeps the bulk density at the right kind of ratio. So if you're trying to mix really wet food scraps with wet wood chips, that mixture is going to be extremely wet and also extremely dense. So it's going to make the auger work harder. The air is going to have a harder time flowing through the pile. So by keeping that carbon dry and balancing the carbon to nitrogen ratio 2-to-1 by volume, 1-to-1 by weight, you're ensuring that the bulk density is around 800 pounds per yard or less, which is allowing that airflow and kind of the ease of movement through the process. And so some of you might be wondering, what about contamination? So keeping the machine running is only part of it. We want to make sure the material coming in is as clean as possible. So how do we train the community or the participants to participate correctly? Contamination, spoiler alert, there's no silver bullet to address contamination. There's no technological solution, at least not at this scale, to prevent contamination from occurring. Contamination, for composting, those materials exist in our waste stream. So if you're using something like an earth flow, the machine will still run. If you're putting trash or plastic in, the auger is powerful, it'll keep turning, the air will keep pumping. But as you know, dirty input means a contaminated output. So we don't want plastics getting shredded inside of the vessel because that could compromise our finished compost. And that could become a liability, potentially have to get sent back to the landfill, or have people in the garden club really disappointed with what they were once supporting and promoting, this composting project, if they see plastic in their compost. So we don't want that. We don't want our ROI to get destroyed, our arguments to get destroyed. So we have to employ a multi-layered approach. So contamination mitigation on the front end of the process and on the back end of the process. So a good way to set this up kind of at this residential, or if you're on a campus, small scale, is with education. So that might look like requiring participants, they can have access to the composting program free of charge, but in order to gain access, they have to pass like a 5-minute composting 101 quiz online. And once they pass that quiz, they get a code, an access code to the bins that maybe are locked at the drop sites at parks around the neighborhood. So once you pass the quiz, you get the code, then you can go to the bins, put your food scraps in. If you didn't take the quiz or didn't pass the quiz, you don't get the code. You can't put your food scraps in. So in the city of Charleston, where I live, that simple strategy of the quiz and the code has resulted in almost zero contamination. I was on the committee to help kind of get that program off the ground, and we were anticipating that the bins were going to be quite contaminated we were shocked by how well that small approach worked. So educating, making sure access to the program is a privilege, and having that quiz and maybe a code. But education doesn't stop there. We want to pair the training with signage, right? I should have put a picture of signage. I'm sure you guys have seen, but in addition to having trained the residents maybe at home or at a workshop, once they get to the carts, it's helpful to have really clear signage. What can go in, what doesn't go in. Maybe they forgot about the rubber band or the produce sticker, or they thought their bag was a compostable bag, but it's a plastic bag. So you can see in the picture here, somebody put in their loaf of Wonder Bread, but they didn't take the plastic wrapper off. So little reminders like that can go a long way. But even after all that's said and done, just want to plan for some contamination getting in there. You know, we're all humans. Humans are imperfect. So that contamination will still occur no matter how good your quiz is, how good your signage is. So maybe on the front end, you want to arm your operators with, you know, like a little trash grabber and instruct them to do a quick look into the bin and a sweep of if there's visible trash or a Coke can to pull it out, and have a small trash can on site next to your compost machine or your compost system. Trash can and a recycling bin in case some of those materials get in, then you can make sure they get to the right place. And then on the back end, depending on your scale, depending on your budget, you can screen out the material. So whether you're screening out the overs, if you want the really soft kind of fine material, maybe you're selling the compost or giving it to gardeners, you can put the overs back in the machine. And through that screening process, you can also screen out any produce stickers or plastic spoons that people thought was a compostable spoon. So you're going to want to have a process set up on the front end and the back end to just account for those micro contaminants. Okay, so we're almost to the end of my presentation. Yay, we can get to the Q&A and discussion. But to kind of wrap things up, so you've got a pilot, it's performing well, it's successful, it's off the ground. Where do you go from there? You know, maybe it's a small system and you might outgrow it, or it's getting really popular, more and more people want to participate. So another term that I'm hearing more and more that I love is this hub and spoke model. So the true power of this decentralization strategy, it's not just about getting one successful project or 10 successful projects off the ground. It's about using these models and these examples as a repeatable blueprint for your whole region. So by proving that we can manage food waste seamlessly without causing any environmental disasters or major odors, no runoff, minimal labor, we start unlocking the ability to scale this using a hub and spoke model. So instead of building one massive multi-million-dollar centralized facility that forces that long distance hauling and traffic, we can start to deploy these modular containerized systems right at our existing convenience centers in our existing communities. So as we add more processing nodes to our network, the financial returns start to compound exponentially. Every new vessel we place into service means fewer dump trucks on the road, fewer tons paying heavy tipping fees at the regional landfills, and a permanent reduction in our long-term waste liabilities. So ultimately, this network transforms the waste management strategy from sort of an out-of-sight, ongoing taxpayer expense and liability into a true circular economy engine. So we can stop throwing money away, stop throwing valuable resources away, and start generating thousands of cubic yards of pristine, high-grade soil amendment that goes right back into our county parks, public roadsides, and local agricultural initiatives. So we have the funding strategies, the regulatory green lights, the mechanical blueprints, and the community engagement frameworks ready to deploy, and people like me and others in the industry and the community ready to help support you every step of the way. So I want to thank you all for your time, for joining today, taking time out of your Tuesday, and for your attention. And now I'll pass it back to Chris so we can open the floor to any questions.
Okay, we have so many questions. I would like to start with the ones that are in the chat. So allow me to start with those. The first one we have that seemed appropriate was from Muguro David Nguye. He's kindly asking, can organizations outside the USA be funded, especially from Global South, who are in the circular economy entrepreneurship, like my organization? I train other actors in composting in the urban biodegradable waste. So I guess he just had a question about how he can get funding. We need to have a mute there. Yeah,
okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And also, again, I just want to emphasize a lot of experts in the chat, in the room. Please, raise your hand if you have answers to add to this. What I can say, what I know is that there is some kind of, international funding available, whether it's through organizations like the United Nations, international development funds. But I think a good strategy in some of the more developing parts of the world is looking for those public-private partnerships. So that might be, for example, like a resort or a hotel in your area that's generating a lot of waste. They're probably paying a lot of money to have that waste hauled away. And they might also be interested in, the marketing opportunity to be able to share to their guests, like, hey, we're a green resort, we're composting, we're using it here to grow food. So if you in your community have the expertise to be a hauler, to be an operator, to manage the program, that's typically what these resorts don't want to deal with, right? They maybe don't have the expertise, they don't have the interest to run a program, but they've got the land and they have the capital to be able to host something like a small in-vessel system so that you could then blend feedstocks from not only their resort, but also from the community and really get a program going that way.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing here. David, if you can prove to them with a financial spreadsheet that it's more effective for them to be doing this, that would be the first thing that they would turn their heads. Show them that it's financially effective. And that would be a great way to manage it, where you don't have something like US federal funding. That might be a great way to go forward with that. The next question we have is from Sonal Ferns. Does this setup require complete waste segmentation at the source? Does ambient environmental temperature interfere with the anaerobic digestion process?
Okay, great question. So with what I've been talking about today, it's primarily aerobic decomposition. So we do have the presence of oxygen, unlike anaerobic, which does not allow the presence of oxygen. So it's creating that methane that's sometimes captured for heat transfer energy. But for this type of aerobic hot composting, and in what we were looking at, so that kind of in-vessel using a shipping container, the way that's built out and retrofitted, it's highly insulated. So regardless of the climate, maybe you're in the desert, maybe you're in the tundra, there might be some measures we want to take, like covering the machine with a wooden lean-to so it doesn't get covered in a block of ice, or, really those control panels and the electrical components scorched by the sun. But typically, these are sea cans, so they're designed for kind of extreme all-weather outdoor conditions. So they don't need to be placed in a building. Some people choose to put them in a building, maybe if they live in a really rainy climate and they just don't want to get wet as the operator. But no, so I think your question was, does the ambient temperature of the environment impact the composting process in this type of example? So not really. It's going to be a hot 131 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, that thermophilic phase, whether it's snowing outside or hot outside. The machine does a good job of maintaining that internal temperature. Does that answer the question?
Well, let me see if let me make it so that people can actually respond if they need to do a follow-up. 1 second here. So people can now unmute themselves if they need to make a follow-up question for Betsy once she has answered the question. Any follow-ups on that? Okay. The next question comes from Jordan Lane. Are all three of these systems capable of processing high food waste feedstock? So in vessel and aerated static pile and the other one. Are those all capable?
Yes, all of those are capable. So you certainly don't have to use an in-vessel system, which is what we were really focusing on today. Selecting your technology, a lot of that comes down to the site that you have, how much space do you have available, and some of those regulations. So if you're looking to start kind of from scratch and start a compost facility where there might not be a good precedent, in-vessel is really helpful because you don't have a lot of, you eliminate a lot of those environmental concerns. But absolutely, you can compost food scraps in any kind of composting technology setup. So windrow, aerated static pile, turned aerated pile, all of that works. Mhm.
Excellent. Once again, I'd like to remind everybody, if you are a professional who has experience in something and you'd like to offer your own feedback on what the questions are, please raise your hand and we'll get to you. So let me get to the next question, which is from Peter Moon, a composting professional. What was the total cost of the Beaufort County in-vessel system, including purchase, shipping, and commissioning? Also, what are the operational costs, power demand, operator, labor, equipment, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So the total cost for the GMT equipment for the Beaufort County program was about $160,000. Their USDA grant, I want to say, I would have to double check, but I think they got about 250,000. So that surplus helped cover some of the softer costs, like the labor. Since they're in their first year of operation, in the first 6 months, really, I think they're still, figuring that out and getting the data to say exactly how much the labor cost is. But I know it's a couple hours a day for their kind of public works folks that were already out at the Shanklin Road facility, doing some similar activities like moving around the yard waste and landscape waste. So now they're kind of changing their work instead of adding new work. In terms of the electrical consumption, so they're using our 20-foot system, which is the smallest one we offer. And that is an electrical consumption of about 20 kilowatt hours per day. So depending on your state and the rate of utility, that kilowatt hour cost, on average, that ends up being about $150 a month for electricity, which, as I understand by some of the research I've done, is extremely low compared to some more energy intensive solutions like the anaerobic digestion or a dehydrator. Let me see if.
Okay, so Neil had a response he would like to make also. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I put two items. I put two items in the chat showing how shared savings can help finance both composting and reuse. Perhaps the most pertinent to this discussion is Camp Small in Baltimore, which is a small 1.5 acre site that the city made a loan to another agency within the city to set up a composting operation. And the composting operation is paying back the interest plus paying back the loan with interest. Plus, it is saving the city tens of thousands of dollars a year just from 1.5 acre site. So it's a terrific example how cities can help promote what Betsy is talking about. The other example is a theoretical example from the city of Detroit, which is starting a major composting program, and it suggests that the city, I'm estimating, costs about $300 to collect and dispose of garbage in a landfill. So if a composting group, a community group or enterprise starts removing these, they deserve some small portion, let's say 10%, which for a composting company is $30 a ton. Added to the other value of composting, it helps stabilize the enterprise financially. And of course, those two examples can be replicated in other cities.
So those are located in the chat. We'll also be sharing the chat when the webinar is over. So all of the information that's here will be saved and we'll share it with our registrants once we're done. Thank you, Neil. Let me go to the next question then. This is from Sasha Faminoff. Question regarding earthflow. Does the auger manage to get all the material up off of the floor? In the schematics, it seems like the auger tip is a bit up off the floor. I wonder if the edges manage to get into the hot parts of the mass. Does the machine have thermometers at the edges, the parts that touch the inside walls?
Yeah, love the technical question, Sasha, and that's a very astute observation. You're right. The auger doesn't quite touch the floor. There is about an inch or so gap. But because of that kind of rotating corkscrew motion that you're noticing, it does manage to pull the material from the bottom to the top and back down again, kind of repeating that process. So it is able to cover most every square inch of the inside of the machine. The walls, the bottom part is leaving a little bit of room for that airflow. And we don't want the auger touching or scraping against the steel welded liner part of the floor. In terms of the temperature, so whether you could be doing that in an automated way or by hand, if you're taking the temperature manually, there's a temperature port that's located right kind of in the middle of the machine. So you would put the probe in right into the middle and check your temperature that way. So as you can imagine, the first day that you put your food scraps in, if it's on the very front end of the vessel, it's not going to be 131 degrees day one. It's going to take a few days to generate that heat, to generate that mass. So typically in the middle of the pile is a good place to take the temperature. It stays there, it stays hot for a few days before moving to the end where it starts to cool off again. So it doesn't need to, the whole pile doesn't need to be hot for the whole time, if that makes sense. So we do take the temperatures from the middle there. And I know we have some earthflow operators on the call today. So I don't know if you guys are still on, but if y'all want to chime in with any of your actual hands-on experience operating the machine, would love to hear from you too. No pressure.
Awesome. Okay. The next question we have is once again from Maburo David Ngige. Does the enclosed aerobic composting release methane gas to the atmosphere? And I know some people have already responded in the chat that there's, I would like to go ahead and ask that you respond to that, Betsy.
Oh, sure. And I don't know if I'm seeing their responses in the chat.
Yeah, one person said less than an aerobic
Okay.
process. So
Yeah.
there might be some, but it'll be a lot less than an anaerobic
Right. Okay,
process.
I see Roberts and Dwayne's down. Yeah, that's exactly right. There's probably, and I don't think that we have any, tracking data. I would love to get some to be able to show like a graph. But I think in any composting process of any size or scale, whether it's backyard, in vessel, aerated static pile, windrow, turned aerated pile, there's going to be a little bit of that release. But I think the really important element is making sure there's enough oxygen in the process to prevent the material from going anaerobic, which, as we know, is really what produces a lot of methane. So again, in this case, having the aeration and the enclosed nature, any process air isn't going directly into the environment. It's going into the biofilter, which is a pile of wet wood chips. So it's absorbing and filtering that process air. So I wish I had a specific, number or data set to share, but it's just a more general answer of very little.
Sasha had a feedback question. I think she had her hand raised just a moment ago. Go ahead, Sasha.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, I kind of realized that maybe it didn't really matter. I think what Betsy said was pretty comprehensive, but about I'm in Sweden, and the time temperature requirements for composting, if it's going to be animal byproduct, if it's green waste, they basically have no requirements. But as soon as you put ABP into the mix, it's just like 70 degrees, 1 hour, no exceptions. And they got to get every square centimeter of that material. So I'm just wondering if there are any if there's any data available on, how long, because it is a continuous slow process, like
Right.
how long does a certain portion of it stay in that process, and how many times would that square centimeter of material go through that heat treatment?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And that question comes up a lot. And I appreciate the perspective from another country, because the regulations are different in every state, in every country. So it's good to hear. And maybe in your case, that continuous flow, continuous agitation would not be the preferred method. Maybe you would prefer a static technology. So maybe a similar like in-vessel system, but without the traveling auger. So it's just a static pile. So you can really dial in and improve. But I would also say that in your case, you'd probably want to rely on the automated temperature monitoring. So you can have that data that's not going to potentially be interrupted from like human error of taking the temperature, be continuously tracked by the sensors inside the machine at different points inside the earth flow to help prove that a little bit more accurately and specifically for your
Do you guys
requirement.
have, if I may just follow up with one
Yeah.
more question, do you guys have any of those like examples on it available as
Yeah, we
for
so
download or?
earth flow, and actually we have partner company called Compost Systems, which is based in Austria.
Yeah.
So Green Mountain and Compost Systems both have another containerized composting system that is just static. So there's no agitation. It's called the containerized composting system, or CSC. So it's not quite a complete composting process because it doesn't include the agitation. If you were to use something like that, you'd probably want to grind and shred the material before loading it in, and then you'd probably compost it more in a batch than the continuous flow.
Yeah. Thank you for your feedback.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Let's see. The next question comes from Paige Hermanson. Does the system require being filled continuously 7 days a week, or does it operate if you don't have enough inputs to fill it continuously? And can it just fill in as the materials come in?
I love these questions because anytime I'm doing a webinar presentation, I forget to say important things and you guys ask the questions of what I forgot. So thanks, Paige. No, you don't have to fill the earth flow all the way to maximum capacity for it to work. So the only drawback to not filling it all the way might be that it would take longer to reach those thermophilic temperatures with less mass, might take longer than just the 21 days. Does it operate if you don't have enough input to fill it continuously? Yes, it'll operate. And can you just fill in as materials come in? Absolutely. So with the Buford example, again, that was a big question they had in the beginning. And really, as they started up, the first few days, the first few weeks, there wasn't much food waste at all coming in. So they had their base layer of wood chips covering the floor before loading in the food scraps. So as you get started that first month, it's going to be longer than 21 days. It's really once the material starts to fill up and the heat starts to warm up that you're cooking with Crisco, as we say, and it starts to get to that 21-day process. But in the beginning, there could be a little bit of a lag if you don't have quite as much material to fill it all the way up. But that doesn't mean it's not going to work. Everything will keep working the same. It might just take a little bit longer.
Neil had a response. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah.
I will need you to unmute.
Yeah. Betsy, thank you for this great information. And my question is, are there examples of community composting drop-off projects which also allow local small businesses to drop off their source-separated organics for a small fee, since these businesses would have to pay a traditional hauler to get rid of their materials if they weren't composting?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's a great question. And that question has come up in the city of Charleston. I live in Charleston County. And what I can say from my experience or that example is it's kind of a case-by-case basis. So as you can imagine, it depends how much material, what's the frequency. So I think to start, depending on the size of your facility, your processing capacity would kind of determine the answer or the appetite to say yes. Because maybe in the beginning, like for Buford, they needed that supplemental material from commercial businesses like restaurants. But once they start going, as more and more residents sign up, they might get to a point where they say, okay, restaurants, your pilot phase of being able to divert at no cost has come to an end. If you'd like to continue, either sign up with the haulers or maybe we can set up, internal pickups, but starting to charge a fee. So I don't know of other examples offhand. I imagine that there are some, but it would probably be on that kind of case by case evolving basis, I would imagine.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Next question is from Madison NB. As for the question about funding in other countries, this was a great question, and we have a follow-up question. Trying to start a community composting in Saudi Arabia, is there any support material you could point us to, or a specific person we could speak to who could guide us a bit with creating the financial spreadsheet that we could present to a secure public-private partnership? So does anybody, this is a in the audience question. We have a lot of internationals here. Please speak out if you have resources that can help Madison NB in Saudi Arabia. Anybody here have that kind of knowledge that they can share? All right. So,
And Madison, you're welcome to
yeah,
email me. Can you guys still see my screen? I realized I didn't put up my final
no,
slide. Okay, I'll press share screen. So please feel free to jot down my email address. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram. You can message us on either platform. There's our web address. So Madison, you're welcome to send me an email and I can share with you the spreadsheet that we have. And I'm happy to help you, fill those numbers in.
all right. So I'm going to remove that for now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Betsy. So the next question is one that actually comes to my own heart. John Oral asks, what wear parts or maintenance schedule does the earth flow require? Is this done by a professional, or can it be done by the operator? So for instance, the auger and the frame that the auger sits on, all of that. What's involved with that?
Yeah. So we do have a kind of timeline, forgetting the term right now, of lifespan, sort of expectancy of the major components. There aren't too many with this machine, which is another benefit, compared to some other mechanical composting methods, but the auger, certainly, the spare chain, and then the control panels we have a blower box and the VFD, variable frequency drive, that controls the auger motor. So those are kind of the main internal components that would have a lifespan. We have a standard kind of 1-year parts and labor warranty. Typically, it's not until about year 5, hopefully, especially if you're following the recommended ratios of the right amount of carbon and nitrogen, you're not putting in too much bulk density, if you're operating the machine based on how we trained. Typically, you hopefully won't start to see breakdown or need to repair until about that 5-year mark. We have a spare parts package that a lot of folks in really rural areas like to purchase when they get their equipment, so that if they do have a part go down, they have those spare parts already at their site, ready to go. And then, is this done by a professional or can it be done by the operator? We like to train all of our operators to have the tools, the information, the skills to be able to do their own repairs. That's another cost savings mechanism for the communities, for the operators. And Green Mountain Technologies provides what we call free and unlimited remote training and support for the life of the program. So as long as you're composting with the Earthflow, our team of engineers and experts is able to support you, answer your question, troubleshoot. That includes, staff turnover, or if you have a whole new, team that's trying to figure out how to operate the machine, and we've already trained you on a former team, we'll do a retraining. So we like to set it up so that you can do it yourself with our support remotely. But some people still prefer to rely on maybe their in-house HVAC technician. So they would have that HVAC person come to the training when we're there, the in-person training, so their HVAC person knows how to replace the chain, for example. So a little bit of both, kind of depends on your preference.
Okay. We have some other questions here. We could keep going. Robert Wadley asks, wouldn't this be the opposite of hub and spoke? The term seems more appropriate to centralized systems, and I'd like to push back a little bit on this. To me, it sounds more like multiple nodes, maybe some slightly larger, some slightly smaller, but they're all kind of functioning at similar levels, but they're nodes more than they are centralized, or like one major hub with everything going to that one area. It's more interspersed nodes. Does that make more sense, Betsy? Or
yeah, and it's definitely the terminology can start to get confusing. Centralized, decentralized, hub and spoke. I think with, what I was going for with that hub and spoke analogy is having multiple hubs and spokes, right? So like, again, using South Carolina as the example, traditionally or to date, we only had those 4 big facilities. So those were the hubs. And then the spokes all had to kind of drive to those big hubs. So if you start building out that network, so state of South Carolina, again, is releasing a new grant funding for the state called a hub and spoke grant. So the idea is specifically to reduce reliance on the limited facilities and build out more of that infrastructure network. So Beaufort County, now they have their own little compost facility with the earth flow. So they have their own little hub. So instead of just 4 hubs and, 500 spokes, maybe there are now 20 hubs and 100 spokes or something like that. So you're creating more smaller hubs throughout your whole region.
Okay, so I'd like to further see in my own mind, if I understand this correctly, what I'm hearing is this is not like a transfer station for recycling where you've got people bringing stuff to one space that will then be hauled to another space. This is where instead of it being transferred to another space, you're bringing this to that space and it's going to stay there. And then it'll be that byproduct will be spread out in the local parks and however it may be used or given to farmers, etc. So is that where we're going with that? It's not a transfer station. It's
Right. And, I'll just to add to that, it could also be approached in a transfer station type of methodology. Like maybe you do have just the aerated vessel that's not agitated. So you're bringing food scraps from a bunch of different communities to this aerated vessel, putting it on air. So it's not going anaerobic. It's not creating environmental hazards or odors. But then maybe you take that whole vessel, with a flatbed or something and move it to hopefully a nearby larger facility that has the machinery to be able to mix and blend and,
That's clever.
grind and screen. So
Yeah.
it
That's
could
really
be,
clever.
could be
Yeah.
both. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. The next question is from Ashley Kale. Could we see and possibly take the 5-minute composting quiz to get an idea of the questions they ask?
Yeah, actually, definitely. I think if you just go to Google and type in City of Charleston Compost Program, it'll take you to the website, which is housed on the City of Charleston, web network. It's like one page. And then you should be able to click the link to take the quiz to participate and see that sample quiz. And if that doesn't work for whatever reason, or if that seems, not preferred, reach out to me and I should be able to get a copy of that quiz and I can email it to you. But I think that you can take the quiz on their website.
Awesome. Celia Patterson asks, in Utah, end markets for compost are having challenges due to PFAS contamination. Are you seeing this in other communities, and are you aware of any in-vessel units that can destroy those molecules?
I wish our in-vessel units could destroy those molecules. I am definitely familiar with those concerns. Conversations and concerns are popping up all over the country, all around the world. And I think collectively, we are looking for that solution to destroy the molecules. I don't know if we found them yet. If someone else on the call knows, please share. But unfortunately, I don't think we have that solution yet.
The problem with it is that PFAS molecules tend to be, they'd have to be burned at such a high temperature that you'd also destroy your compost.
Okay, yeah.
It couldn't really work. I'm not sure how I'm sure somebody is working on it. I'm looking forward to see that happen. That's for sure. I wish we had an easy answer.
Me too.
So David, Meguro David Ngie asks again, does the enclosed aerobic composting release the methane gas into the atmosphere? And I guess we already answered that one. I'm sorry. Let's see here. Looking for more questions. So yeah, here we go. Gary Liss asks, which states have the best regulations that encourage investments in these small scale systems for others to replicate? It looks like Courtney Brown answered here. We think California has a successful grant model from GGRF funds that invests the regional CC infrastructure development and local jobs. Let's see, there's something in the way here, as well as public education and shared learning opportunities statewide. And she provides a link to that. Did you have anything you'd like to add, Betsy?
For the best states, I don't know. I probably should look at all the state regulations and pick out if there's one that really has an easy pathway to in-vessel permitting. But I really do like this Beaufort County model because it's in a state that didn't really have there wasn't a pathway. There was nothing in the regulations about in-vessel technology. They didn't even really know what that was yet. So I think in any state, whether there's an easy path or maybe the path seems really blocked, using that method of collaborating with the regulators and just asking them like, hey, here's the technology we're thinking about using. How does this fit in, to your model? I think that's going to be your best bet, whether it's an easy path or there's no path or it's a hard path.
Okay, so we have at least two model legislations or models that we can use that Gary's could refer to. If anybody has additional suggestions, please add them beyond Gary's question here. Just, here we go. Courtney added another link here for ILSR. So if anybody has other links, please put them in there before we close today. And that way we'll have them for our chat later. So also Neil talks about how there's another model scale. I think we already talked about this, the Loop Closed, a composting company in Washington, D.C. that specializes in school site composting. And that there's a link for that as well. Let's see. Sasha asks again, microfinancing, especially if you are a nonprofit. I'm not really sure how to handle that one. Does any of us here have examples of microfinancing that we can answer for Sasha?
Sorry, Chris, I was kind of referring to the Saudi Arabia question about funding for international funding. I think microfinancing is often a venue or an option, especially for nonprofits.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Sasha.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. John Orrell says that Kiva is a good organization for international small business fundraising. I have to agree. I've heard of them. They do good work. Stella Peterson asks, in case my question was missed, in Utah, no, I think we already did that one. Yeah. Let's see. Does anybody have any other questions? Please raise your hand if we have not answered your question, or if you have another question that you have thought of in the meantime. Okay. Well, if we've answered all the questions and nobody has any additional questions, we've pretty much, oh, wait a minute, Ruta, go ahead, Ruta. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Chris. There was something in the chat that was saying that biochar works with on PFAS, but how does biochar work together with composting?
Betsy, did you want to answer that first, or?
Yeah, happy to take a stab at that. So, I've asked this question myself because I'm certainly not an expert on biochar, but from what I understand, the biochar, the word char is kind of a hint. It's already been under such a high heat process that a lot of those beneficial microbes, they're not present anymore in that material. So I think the role of biochar in compost is more as like an amendment to add to the finished compost and like a premium blend that's really enhancing the nutrient value of the finished compost rather than using it to like expedite the process or something like that. And Chris, yeah, please add on if you know more about that.
I have a few comments on this. First of all, biochar is an important part of any kind of gardening where you're using something to amend your soil. And it's not always going to be useful in all situations. But in some situations, it is kind of important. Basically, biochar is just charcoal. It's where you burn something without oxygen so that you preserve the carbon within the structure, and you get something that it's almost like a ceramic. You can actually knock it, and it'll make a sort of a ringing sound if you make it just right. But when you crush it up and you make it into fine powder, you can add it as an amendment to your soil, and it increases, especially for soils that don't hold a lot of humus. It will increase the cation exchange capacity, or CEC, so that you have the ability to hold on to water a little bit longer, hold on to nutrients a little bit longer before they slip out of the soil. If you have a very sandy soil, for instance, biochar can help make the soil hold on to those nutrients just a little bit longer so that the roots can get in there and access them. So in some situations, biochar is a very useful amendment for your soil. It can also be put into the finished compost as part of an amendment for that compost. It's not necessarily something that people are doing right now on a large scale. And in fact, some people are using biochar as a carbon credit greenwashing kind of thing. They'll say that we're making biochar and people can use it for this, but they end up not really using it for that. They end up burning it instead. And you can burn biochar if it's in a carbon, but if it looks like the regular pieces of wood or charcoal that you might actually burn in a barbecue pit or something like that. So there are advantages to using biochar, and the thing is, you don't need much. You really don't need a lot. So when people create biochar and say that we're making biochar and we're saving with carbon credits by doing this, they're kind of switching the cards around a little bit here. It's not really helping. You only need a little bit, and for that amount, it makes sense. But anything over that, you're really not helping the environment. Biochar is important in some instances. So I hope that helps explain biochar for some people.
Sounds like we need a biochar webinar.
Yeah.
But it doesn't explain the PFAS question.
It doesn't. It's not. I don't think it will help with the PFAS. If anything, biochar will latch onto them because of the high cation exchange capacity. It will latch onto them for some time, but I'm not sure how long or how durable that latching on of the PFAS it will be. I think it might be something that needs further study, but it's not the same as destroying the PFAS. All you're doing is sucking it up into the biochar char. It's not quite the same. So it doesn't destroy it. It just locks it in position for a little while. And I don't know how long that time is. So yeah, we definitely need to have a biochar talk at some point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that helps. Betsy, I want to thank you so much for this incredible webinar that you have presented for us today. I really appreciate everything that you've presented today. And we've had so many lovely questions from our audience. I want to thank our audience for coming from all over the world to talk about composting and how to set it up in a fashion that will work for people. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much for attending. Did anybody else have any things that they would like to say before we close?
Yeah, I just want to give the thanks right back to you, Chris, for organizing this, and what an outstanding, huge turnout. It's been an honor to talk with all of you and learn from you and share these examples. I hope it's helpful. Please don't hesitate to reach out. A big part of my job is just to help, answer these questions and walk people through this process. So if you have any questions, happy to help. And yeah, this was by far the highlight of my week. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day and being here today.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great week.